Okay, we'll hop into it. Thanks for your tenacity and persistence in attending this after lunch panel. Appreciate it. So we have 3 papers today that focus around the theme of O'Connor and the outsider. Jessica Lyons teaches at Georgia State University in Atlanta. She'll be speaking to us about the extra people of the world, xenophobia and anti-miscegenation in O'Connor's The Displaced Person. Rosie Hall is a recent graduate of Ave Maria, is headed to Oxford this fall. She'll be speaking to us about I Have Always Been Scared of You, Flannery O'Connor and Sylvia Plath on the fear of foreign bodies in post-war America. And I'm John Hayes. I teach at Augusta University in Augusta, Georgia. I'll be talking about O'Connor, Southern exceptionalism, and the cost of racial change. We'll just hop right into it, and as with other panels, we'll keep our questions and comments at the end of all 3 papers. We are confronted with an unholy alliance of the self-styled and professed Northern liberals. Georgia's longtime U.S. Senator Richard B. Russell declared on February 26, 1964, at the beginning of what would turn out to be the longest continuous debate in the Senate's history. A powerful bloc of Southern Democrats had chosen Russell, son of Ina Dillard Russell, namesake of what's now the Russell Senate Office Building, to lead the charge against the proposed Civil Rights Act. In an evening news brief to his Georgia constituents, Russell warned that the bill, quote, grows out of a skillfully conducted hate the South campaign that has been waged in an effort to make the Southern people appear as depraved, ignorant people who are in need of a guardian. In the face of such an attack, Russell insisted that, quote, with great pride, I declared this afternoon on the floor of the Senate that I resented with every power of my being this hate campaign against the South, that I was proud to be a Southerner, and that the people of the South were kindly, generous, courageous, and patriotic people. You don't have to look that far in Flannery O'Connor's writings to find similar expressions of thin-skinned regional defensiveness. What I hate most is its being in the New Yorker, she wrote to Betty Hester of Eudora Welty's 1963 story, Where's the Voice Coming From? And quote, all the stupid Yankee liberals smacking their lips over typical life in the dear old dirty Southland, as Welty explored the psychology of racism. O'Connor was incensed not the racist violence that had sparked the story, which is the assassination of NAACP leader Medgar Evers in his driveway, but how the story seemed to confirm longstanding tropes of Southern depravity and Northern righteousness. Indeed, in her earlier stories, The Enduring Chill, that's 1958, and Everything That Rises Must Converge, 1961, her narrative scorn fell not on complacent racists like Mrs. Fox or Julian's mother, but rather on their sons, would-be liberals seeking to defy the customs of Jim Crow. Asbury and Julian are depicted as ingrates. They're grasping at racial equality as naive and pseudo-religious. When Asbury smoked with Randall and Morgan, it's satirized as, quote, one of those moments of communion where the difference between black and white is absorbed into nothing. While Julian is self-absorbed and juvenile, walking along, quote, saturated in depression, as if in the midst of his martyrdom, he had lost his faith, sitting next to a black man, quote, in reparation, as it were, for his mother's sins. Visiting Georgetown University less than 2 months after the 1963 March on Washington, O'Connor wanted to talk about the South and religion, but she found journalists obsessed about race. All the Washington reporters can ask you about is integration, she fumed in exasperation to Marriott Lee. At the march, the civil rights movement had pushed the nation to confront racism, but at Georgetown, O'Connor sounded parochial and tribal. The South is traditionally hostile to outsiders, traditionally against intruders, foreigners from Chicago or New Jersey, all those who come from afar with moral energy that increases in direct proportion to their distance from home. As with Welty's story, what seemed to trouble O'Connor was not the immorality of Jim Crow, but the supposedly greater immorality of self-righteousness, those zealous activists who would have been better people if they just stayed at home. And in the summer of 1964, as her health declined rapidly, as the logjam broke and the Senate did pass the Civil Rights Act, O'Connor expressed a kind of gotcha glee that racism was finally being exposed in the North too. When Black New Yorkers took to the streets and rebelled against police brutality, she wrote caustically to Marriott Lee, the racial front appears to have switched momentarily to Harlem. The onus was actually off the South for change. She continued in another letter to Mariette Lee, as far as me and Senator Russell are concerned, she noted with provocative solidarity, those riots couldn't be located in a better place than Harlem, not to mention Rochester and Brooklyn. Maybe the stupid Yankee liberals could take the log out of their own eye and point the finger at themselves for change, quit picking on the South. Okay, what I want to suggest today is not just O'Connor and Russell in this knee-jerk regional offensiveness, but in fact, the dominant national discourse about racism was, and in many ways still is, stuck in a frame that imagines it as a distinctly Southern thing. Think about the dominant memory of the civil rights movement. Racism was Jim Crow. It was Southern segregation. And when the civil rights movement dramatized the injustice of this, the nation fixed the problem. It fixed the problem by fixing the South in the form of the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, 1964 and 1965. Or think back to the intense, brief national reckoning with racism in summer 2020. 5 years later, what tangible changes can one point to? There's been hardly any reform of policing. In fact, backlash legislation in some states seeking to prevent reflection on race or racism. But a few things have actually changed. A number of Confederate monuments have been removed from public display, and some military bases have been, I need to edit this. Some military bases named for Confederate generals have been renamed. Some have been renamed and since renamed, but anyway. I'm no Confederate, I'm no neo-Confederate. I've been very active in Augusta trying to move our Confederate monument. But I've been struck in hindsight by how quickly the nation's consciousness gravitated to symbols of the Confederacy. As if to concretize our racial reckoning, we had to turn to the South. This notion that racism is located in the South is a pillar of what historians Kevin Cruz and Matthew Laster call the myth of Southern exceptionalism. Make an expansive claim about the United States with liberty and justice for all. Add an asterisk, oh yeah, there's the South. Is that really America? Is that it's the exception of the national rule. It's that strange, exotic national other. As historian James Cobb has noted, this idea of an exceptional South has had great utility for a nation that wants very much to believe in or assert its own innocence. The myth of Southern exceptionalism has actually propped up the myth of American innocence and of American exceptionalism. Okay, what I also want to argue today, though, and this is why we're gathered here 100 years after O'Connor's birth, is that O'Connor had uncommon, perhaps even unlikely, given what I just said, insight into what it would mean to truly confront racism. This was grounded, I believe, in her conception of human beings, a conception rooted in her theology. I'll try to prove this claim through a circuitous route, revolving around the notion of cost. In a 1959 letter to Louise Abbott, O'Connor sought to comfort and counsel her younger friend, as Abbott expressed a very personal struggle with doubt. I know what torment this is, O'Connor wrote in Solidarity, but I can only see it in myself anyway as the process by which faith is deepened. A faith that just accepts is a child's faith and all right for children, but eventually you have to grow religiously as every other way, though some never do. Then turning outward, she insisted, what people don't realize is how much religion costs. They think that faith is a big electric blanket, when of course it is the cross. It is much harder to believe than not to believe. 8 years later, in what would turn out to be his last book, the 1967 masterpiece, Where Do We Go From Here?, Martin Luther King Jr. surveyed the national landscape and wrote with prophetic critique. The practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the more significant changes involved in voter registration required neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice. The real cost, this 1967, lies ahead. The stiffening of white resistance is a recognition of that fact. Then he turned to education, jobs, and housing. and noted just how little had changed in those areas because they involved costs that white America did not want to pay. Now, there's no evidence at all that O'Connor read King or that King read O'Connor, though they were both Georgians, they're contemporaries, and eerily, they both died at age 39. Indeed, it's striking that O'Connor's personal library contains not a single book by a Black author. It certainly shed some awareness of Black thinkers and writers, but in the realms of ideas and literature, the inspiration's sparring partners were all white. Even in the face of the tectonic drama of civil rights, it was not Black activists, but white liberals, and when she wanted to taunt Marriott Lee segregationists, who were the significant others in her consciousness. Let me return briefly, though, to the enduring chill and everything that rises must converge, the two stories where she skewers white liberals. Asbury longs to establish rapport with Randall and Morgan, defends her intelligence to his racist mother, insists to them that the world is changing, and that there's no reason I shouldn't drink after you or you after me, and requests a visit from them alone as he lies ailing on what he thinks is his deathbed. Isn't he the type of young Southerner who, in defiance of family and tradition, joined the civil rights movement? Similarly, while Julian's mother sees danger and social dissolution on the newly desegregated buses, while she alternates between old-style paternalism and rising racial resentment, Julian is determined to break ranks and challenge the mindset from which he came. He pushes back against his mother's resentment and lambasts her paternalism, makes a point of sitting next to a Black man on the bus, and even dreams of marrying a Black woman, defending her equality and experience, thereby defying one of Jim Crow's most basic taboos. Isn't he the kind of young Southerner who in 1961 was on what many would call the right side of history? So why are Julian and Asbury the objects of O'Connor's critique? If we pay close attention to the details of the stories, a logic does emerge. Even if O'Connor, and indeed the dominant national discourse about race, didn't have the categories to articulate it. Asbury comes home to a mother who owns and oversees a small dairy farm with Black workers. Even as he disparages the small-mindedness around him, he doesn't question the economic basis and its racial hierarchy. Julian is scathing in his critique of his mother and the rigidity of Jim Crow, yet at signal points in the story, the narrator tells us that he regularly dreams of the family's old plantation mansion, and that he, quote, thought bitterly of the house that had been lost for him. At the very moment he cascades his mother, as it turns out she's dying. Asbury personally benefits from a racially structured economy, while Julian longs for the racially structured economy that his family used to have. Neither thinks to question the racism embedded in the economy. Their anti-racist gestures, while not meaningless, cost them nothing. They continue to be sons of privilege. Contrast this with Dorothy Day, who came to the interracial Koinonia community in Southwest Georgia in 1957 and almost lost her life. Koinonia had become a Klan target, and it was a dangerous place to be. Writing to Betty Hester, O'Connor expressed, as Angela Alamo O'Donnell calls it, radical ambivalence. That's a mighty long way to come to get shot at, she wrote, making light of the violence with a Yankee go-home flair. But she immediately followed it with, I admire her very much. I read this as O'Connor's knee-jerk regional defensiveness, segueing to heartfelt respect for Day's example. It had cost Day something, almost her life. Of course, the struggle for civil rights did cost people their lives. Lethal violence was an ever-present and very real threat. It was the activists who suffered, sometimes fatally, who actually bore the cost, not, to Dr. King's point, the nation with its vast resources. It's O'Connor's late stories, Revelation and Judgment Day, that offer glimpses, profound, I think, of what genuine racial change would cost white people. Not activists, but whites who are the beneficiaries of a racialized social order. These stories came after an uncharacteristically long dry spell. In 1962 and much of 1963, O'Connor didn't write a single story, even as she yearned to do larger things that she doubted her capacity for doing. Of course, she tinkered on Why the Heathen Raged some. Also in 1963, the drama for civil rights reached a fever pitch with the SCLC's dramatic campaign in Birmingham, President Kennedy's televised call for a sweeping new Civil Rights Act, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the March on Washington, and the Klan bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church, the Birmingham movement headquarters. In the wake of these tectonic events, O'Connor's dry spell broke. She found herself writing about race more explicitly than she ever had. Revelation and Judgment Day probe deeply into the white racial imagination. They're multi-layered stories about which much canon has been said. Here I want to zoom in on how they depict costs. Unlike Asbury and Julian, Ruby Turpin is acutely conscious of how her comfortable material status is intrinsically tied to the race and class hierarchies of the social order she inhabits. In the narrative flow of the story, she's critiqued not for recognizing this, but for blithely assuming that it's all God blessed. Just before the book hits her in the face, she bursts out the waiting room, "Thank you, Jesus, for making everything the way it is. It could have been different." The book and the Scowling Girl's attempts to strangle her jolt Turpin into a series of unwelcome epiphanies. In the final vision, she sees her social world turned upside down by a divine reordering. The various social groups have not lost their distinctive identities. Rather, Turpin is given to see a wholesale revaluation of the hierarchy she'd assumed. Those denigrated as last and lowest in social hierarchy are, in Jesus' apocalyptic ordering, the first and the highest. What would genuine social change cost? Well, as Dr. King put it in Where Do We Go From Here, quote, a radical restructuring of the architecture, a revolution of values. Complacent, self-assured whites like Ruby Turpin would have to reorient the entirety of their lives, their values, their status, their understanding of God. Ruby Turpin gets a glimpse, but T.C. Tanner is left grasping. Tanner embodies just how deeply invested in their whiteness whites can be. When we meet him, he has taken the drastic act of uprooting himself from Georgia to live in utter misery with his daughter in New York. Living in a place he hates is better to Tanner than working for a Black doctor who has recently acquired the land Tanner has been squatting on. When the doctor taunts Tanner that, I know you're going to work for me, Tanner sits, quote, as if his spirit had been sucked out of him into the woods, and nothing was left on the chair but a shell. To lose the economic mastery his whiteness has given him is to lose his very self. Yet fleetingly, in a liminal moment 30 years earlier, Tanner had glimpsed a very different vision of self in a mysterious encounter with an enigmatic stranger, a Black man named Coleman Parham. Putting on wooden spectacles that Tanner's hands have unknowingly fashioned, Parham stares directly at Tanner, violating one of Jim Crow's most basic customs. Tanner has, quote, an instant sensation of seeing before him a negative image of himself, as if clownishness and captivity had been their common lot. It's a theological vision of a shared creatureliness. But it fades quickly, and Tanner reverts to demanding mastery and a racial hierarchy. Life in New York becomes so miserable, though, that Tanner determines to escape in it, even if he dies trying. His thoughts go to Coleman and the different vision of self he'd glimpsed. He knows that Coleman, certainly not his daughter, but Coleman would laugh at his bursting out of the coffin Judgment Day joke, expressing solidarity and commonality that Tanner utterly lacks with his own daughter. But he dies suspended in the air, reconnecting with Coleman and the Georgia soul he loves only in death. Is the Judgment Day a cautionary tale about whites being so invested in their whiteness that they're able only to reach but not attain a more fundamental identity? Have they fixated on their whiteness at the considerable, in O'Connor's vision, cost of forfeiting their elemental humanity? If whites could truly divest of their whiteness, would there be anything left of them? These questions about what it means to be white, but just how much is invested in the notion of whiteness, about racial identity and a social order in need of radical restructuring, go far beyond the South and the durable trope that racism in America means correcting an aberrant South, bring it into line with a progressive nation. In 1963 and 64, O'Connor didn't have a means of articulating these questions other than through fiction. Yet had she lived just a little longer and read a little more widely, she would have found one. Let me give 3 examples from 1964. At the Democratic National Convention, Fannie Lou Hamer courageously testified about the violent abuse she had suffered in Mississippi, but then claimed the state's place in the nation and asked scathingly, is this America? At a rally in Harlem that same year, Malcolm X wanted to underscore the severity and scope of racism, and he insisted, America is Mississippi. There's no such thing as the South. It's America. And in his book, The Southern Mystique, Howard Zinn insisted that, quote, the nation reacts emotionally to the South precisely because it subconsciously recognizes itself there. The battle-scarred wisdom of activists like these, of Martin Luther King in the years 1965, 1968, could have resonated with O'Connor and pushed her to conscious awareness of conceptions she was brilliantly evoking in her fiction. Beyond regional defensiveness, to more extensive weighing of the heavy cost of racial change, to more elaborate deconstruction of the myth of American innocence that she never believed in anyway.
Hey, that was really good. So I'm going to be talking about Flannery O'Connor and Sylvia Plath. And at first, just a big thank you to all of the conference organizers, and then to two of my professors who are in the audience who definitely helped me with all of my research on this. So it's certain that the Hillbilly Thomist and Lady Lazarus were never in a room together. Flannery O'Connor is a Catholic writer of the Southern Gothic, and Sylvia Plath's poetry is said to have prefigured second wave feminism. We have Boston and Georgia. Yet both women wrote in the same post-war period, in the same traumatized country, using similar tactics and taking inspiration from Freudian psychoanalysis. Rather than a bomb-pocked landscape, Americans in the post-war years found themselves with the lingering sense that they had been invaded, often by means of the psychological bomb of latent trauma. Both writers used the symbol of rape to represent the invasion of post-war America, Plath in her poem Daddy, and O'Connor in her short story The Displaced Person. Reading The Displaced Person alongside Daddy reveals Mrs. McIntyre's latent trauma in her fear of foreign bodies, and suggests that the fear of bodily violation is key to understanding her character and what motivates her actions. Likewise, though Daddy is often read as a personal poem reflecting Plath's biography, when read alongside O'Connor's The Displaced Person, it can also be read as a political poem, acting out the fear of invasion in a post-war America. In short, though seemingly quite different in both ideology and method, both of these ladies have a lot to say about invasion, trauma, and ultimately how post-war America should seek to resolve both these things. In this paper, I'm going to briefly outline Sigmund Freud's theory of trauma, which is a major influence for both these authors. I'll then give a brief account of the theme of invasion in post-war America. So with that context, I'll offer close readings of both works, and finally examine the works in light of each other, comparing and contrasting the two solutions that the authors propose. So first, Freud. His writing informed both Plath and O'Connor, and he was able to preemptively diagnose post-war America through his definition of trauma. In his book, Studies in Hysteria, Freud lays out his preliminary findings on trauma. Though Freud himself does not offer a comprehensive definition, that would have been too easy. Later scholars such as Kathy Kurth define trauma as an overwhelming experience of sudden or catastrophic events in which the response to the event occurs in the often delayed and uncontrolled repetitive occurrence of a hallucination or other intrusive phenomena. So in a healthy or at least proactive individual, this trauma can be resolved through natural recall of the event and kind of talk therapy, which will wear away the traumatic experience. However, in an unhealthy or repressed individual, of which there are many in O'Connor and Plath, if not recalled and discussed, the trauma will remain, emerging at times to trouble the traumatized person. Freud writes on the trauma of one of his patients, stating that her mind would sometimes spontaneously, sometimes in response to contemporary stimulus, bring her traumas with their accompanying effects bit by bit into her present-day consciousness. Left unresolved, the trauma will remain in the psyche and body of the person. Freud writes, we must presume that the psychical trauma, or more precisely, the memory of trauma, acts like a foreign body, which long after its entry must continue to be regarded as an agent still at work. According to Freud, trauma left unresolved will take over and invade the human psyche. So O'Connor and Plath both read Freud extensively and used his definition of trauma in their work. Trauma, as Freud describes it, is a psychological violation whose presence lingers long after the fact. O'Connor and Plath, to better represent post-war invaded America, write latent trauma into their female characters, which then resurfaces as a fear of bodily violation. So a little bit of historical context. Post-war Americans suffered from the sense that their country had been invaded by forces from the outside, that their country had been violated. So the veterans of the World Wars had returned home missing limbs and suffering from what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. One scholar tells us that in terms of the hospitalized World War II veterans, by 1950, almost half of all of the VA beds were occupied by psychotic patients. This is a lot of people. Before the war, psychoneurosis cases were largely non-existent. After the World Wars, the Veterans Association was forced to develop new treatments for this massive influx of veterans suffering mentally. Not only that, the Nazi enemy had now been replaced by the far more invasive Communist Party. In his book, Flannery O'Connor and the Cold War Culture, John Lance Bacon writes, "The possibility that communism was spreading at home as well as abroad generated much of the anxiety experienced by Americans during the period of the Cold War. The American government were fighting communist infiltration, they claimed, by exposing party members and sympathizers in public life." So between the haunted men in their homes and the enemies hidden among them, post-war Americans were left feeling uneasy and invaded in the wake of World War II. While some scholars such as Bacon claim this fear was largely a phantom, I would argue that given the evidence, the sense of invasion is not entirely ill-founded. So much so that it became the project of American authors like O'Connor and Plath to depict this post-war sense of invasion, often in the Freudian terms of latent trauma. A foreign body is among us. O'Connor is blatantly engaging in this dialogue about post-war America. Her short story, The Displaced Person, depicts a small rural farm owned by the widow Mrs. McIntyre, which is quote unquote invaded by the Polish refugee and his family. Though they're invited, I would say the inhabitants of the farm experience it as a kind of invasion. The daily life and the southern hierarchy of the farm is disrupted by their arrival, and the whole farm fears that the violence which had been enacted upon the Polish family would in turn be enacted upon the inhabitants of the farm. The residents of the farm experience the Guisaks as a kind of invasion, disrupting the cultural norms with foreign bodies, language, and the threat of rape, which calls forth the latent trauma of the residents, specifically Mrs. McIntyre. O'Connor scholar Rachel Carroll writes, quote, "The latent symptoms of historical crisis fail to emerge into ethical comprehension, but instead act as the material for further violence." In other words, instead of processing the trauma, Mrs. McIntyre and the others lash out. Carroll identifies the turning point in The Displaced Person as the moment when Mr. Guisak, in the greatest violation of Southern culture at the time, offers his young cousin's hand in marriage to the African-American farmhand. The phantom rape of white women by Black men, Carroll writes, is the metaphorical apex in the construction of the white South as wronged and violated. It is from this threat that Mrs. McIntyre and Mr. Shortleaf feel secure in the quote-unquote justice of killing the invader, Mr. Guisak. While Carroll and other scholars focus, especially and rightly so, on the racist idea that mixed marriage is akin to rape, upon re-examining the story, Mrs. McIntyre's actions are driven not only by racism, but also by her own trauma. So the trauma of Mrs. McIntyre can be seen more clearly when O'Connor's story is read in light of Daddy. I put a lot of words on there because I was trying to fit the poem onto 2 slides, so I apologize that it's small. This is perhaps Sylvia Plath's most famous poem and a commentary on the result of unresolved trauma inflicted by men. This poem is primarily read as a confessional poem in which Plath depicts the way in which her dead father has influenced her life. His presence is overwhelming and violating. His death acts as a progressively pervasive latent trauma on the speaker in her poem. Just a little context, Plath's father died when she was 8 and she never got to see him in his coffin. She never saw her father dead, which from earlier talks fits rather nicely into that. So throughout the poem, the speaker states, "I used to pray to recover you, and then I never could talk to you." The compulsion to reconnect with her father becomes stronger, and the speaker becomes more desperate. The poem says, "I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought that even the bones would do." When that fails, the speaker attempts to recover her father through marriage, and the trauma becomes even more pervasive as the trauma of her father's death violates her in a literal bodily way. Quote, "And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw, and I said, I do, I do." That's there. So the speaker's relationship with her father is read as a kind of bodily rape through the vehicle of the husband in Plath's poem. So the trauma from the speaker's father, which is then experienced as a kind of rape, can help the attentive reader to see in Mrs. McIntyre not only a racist white Southern woman, but a racist white Southern traumatized woman. Rereading the story through this lens, through the threat of bodily rape, reveals textual evidence that Mrs. McIntyre had been previously abused in some way, shape, or form. We know that Mrs. McIntyre had 3 husbands. O'Connor writes, quote, "Mr. Coombs, her second, was 40 miles away in the state asylum. And Mr. McIntyre, her last, was intoxicated, she supposed, in some hotel room in Florida. But the judge, sunk in the cornfield with his family, was always at home." Mrs. McIntyre's first and arguably favorite husband, the judge, left her in poverty when he died. Mr. Coombs was mentally unwell, and Mr. McIntyre was a drunkard. Later, Mrs. McIntyre cries, "They're all the same. It's always been like this. 20 years of being beaten and done in." Putting these pieces together, it becomes clear that Mrs. McIntyre's marriages were not happy ones, and she perhaps had been literally beaten, and at the very least has had things taken from her time and time again. You think of the angel statue in the graveyard that was stolen. I'm not justifying Mrs. McIntyre's actions in the story, far from it, that's not the goal. However, reading O'Connor's story in light of Plath's poem reveals the latent Freudian trauma O'Connor wrote into this character, who experiences disruption to her home as a potential threat of bodily violation. On the other hand, reading Plath in light of O'Connor reveals a deeper message in the poem Daddy, which is typically relegated to the realm of the confessional. What makes this poem both famous and infamous is the constant references to Nazi Germany, quotes like, "And your neat mustache and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzerman, oh you." She calls herself a Jew many times. While many critique Plath for his use of catastrophe to describe her own personal suffering, the scholar Al Strangeways argues that you cannot reduce Plath's work to the merely confessional. Rather, Strangeways states that the ineffable suffering of the Holocaust becomes graspable through the lens of our own personal suffering. Strangeways points out that Plath's reading of Freud and other commentators like Erich Fromm reveals that she had the historical, psychological, and sociological in mind when she was writing about the personal. The poem Daddy for Strangeways works, quote, "by confronting the readers with and compounding the problematic distinctions and connections between the private and the historical, our lives and their suffering." So according to Strangeways, Plath's personal psychological poetry is intimately connected to the sociological historical and should be viewed with reference to the other. So I follow Strangeways' arguments to their natural conclusions, and reading Plath alongside O'Connor has made it clear to me that her use of rape in the poem Daddy is not only confessional, but also a sociological commentary on the state of post-war America. So now is when I should have shifted the slide. It is at this point in my paper that I'd like to turn to the way in which both authors deal with the resolution of trauma. Freud not only unknowingly diagnosed post-war culture, he also set about prescribing a cure, conversation. He insisted that trauma must be verbalized and writes, "Recollection without affect almost invariably produces no result. It must be brought back to its status nascendi and then given verbal utterance." For Freud, vocalization of trauma is necessary to resolve trauma. This is Freud's contemporary Joseph Brera and his co-author of the book I mentioned earlier. And he says it's a natural part of human life to want to confess the trauma. He writes, "We meet the same urge to rid ourselves of the untasteful as one of the basic facets of the major historical institution, the Roman Catholic confessional. Telling things is a relief. It discharges tension, even when the person to whom they're told is not a priest, or even when no absolution follows. Plath and O'Connor used Freud's diagnosis and prescription in their own works, using their characters' silence or vocalization to show how the characters either resolved or did not resolve their trauma. From a purely Freudian point of view, Plath presents the healthiest option for resolving the trauma of her time. Plath's speaker kills her father with words, vocalizing the trauma as Freud recommends and overcoming it. So I've put the two endings, the O'Connor and then Plath. So it's, I've killed one man, I've killed two, the vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. So the poem itself has a triumphant tone with that nursery rhyme-like rhythm to it. Plath's speaker, by vocalizing the trauma in this way, resolves its latent influences, according to Freud's description and diagnosis. If post-war America was attempting to whitewash and bury trauma, in this poem, Plath is showcasing the purely Freudian way to handle it. She does not shy away from using the Holocaust images and languages. She does not sugarcoat the semi-rape she describes. She lays it all out in the open, and at long last rids herself of the foreign body by acknowledging its oppressive presence under which she has been silent for so long. This resolution is not without its violence, however, obviously, and it kind of comes off sounding more like revenge than the resolution that perhaps we're looking for when resolving trauma. The same cannot be said for O'Connor's characters. According to Freud's conception of the traumatic, where Plath's violent ending is a therapeutic vocalization, the violence in O'Connor is the result of the unresolved invasion of the foreign body of trauma. The trauma of the world wars, which had been pervasive and unresolved in the story, comes to a head in the death of Mr. Guisac. There is nothing resolved by this act, nothing has been vocalized. Even amongst the three murderers, there is little to no communication before, during, or after Mr. Guisac dies. Mrs. McIntyre she never actually talks to him or fires him. She seems to be hoping that he'll go away on his own. She repeatedly tries to fire him, finds herself unable to do so. The silence of O'Connor's characters is in direct contrast to Plath's speaker. Characters in O'Connor cling to their trauma, while Plath's speaker releases it. Again, according to a purely Freudian viewpoint, Plath's speaker succeeds and O'Connor's characters fail. Yet O'Connor places her finger on something that Plath does not. She leaves her story very open-ended. She points to a deeper reality that Plath rejects throughout the poem Daddy. That's a whole other paper about Plath and God and all of that. But Plath presents a textbook Freudian answer to trauma. Like Thomas Aquinas, Flannery took what was good and true in Freud and left the rest. God and grace in O'Connor's story are as slippery and subtle as in any O'Connor work. A peacock opens its feathers, a Catholic priest with a strange accent, a broken and beaten down human being. Yet at the end of the displaced person, these are the things that remain. O'Connor ends her story, Mrs. McIntyre's, eyesight grew steadily worse, and she lost her voice altogether. Not many people remembered to come out to the country to see her, except the old priest. He came regularly, once a week, with a bag of breadcrumbs, and after he had fed these to the peacock, he would come in and sit by the side of her bed and explain the doctrines of the church. For a Freudian purist, this ending could be read as bitter and ironic. Here is a priest to hear her confession of trauma, and Mrs. McIntyre has lost her voice. However, I don't believe Mrs. McIntyre to be a lost cause, and I don't think Flannery did either, though you're willing to fight me on it. There is still time and room for her to find peace, even after her trauma and the violence it caused. The violence is not a resolution, as in Plath's poem, but a classic O'Connor invitation to grace for Mrs. McIntyre. It is difficult to comprehend grace and goodness coming out of tragedy, yet this is what O'Connor points to time and time again in her stories. Plath and O'Connor, though dealing with similar themes, time periods, and questions, pose two different resolutions to the problem of trauma and invasion. Plath points to vocalization and violence, while O'Connor somehow sees trauma and violence as an invitation to grace and God. Both O'Connor and Plath use the theme of bodily rape as the central turning point of their works. The way in which they use this symbol can add deeper layers of meaning to the displaced person and Daddy, respectively. Add to this the fact that both O'Connor and Plath were young women, writing about the theme of bodily violation was perhaps a closer analogy to them than it may have been to male writers. Both influenced by the thought of Freud and the culture of their times, these two women shed light on one another's work and on the psychological consequences and resolution of the trauma of post-war America. O'Connor's story, typically read as a political social commentary, becomes deeper when read with the reality of the latent trauma. While many consider Plath to be simply confessional when read in light of O'Connor, it's clear she's engaging in the broader conversation than that of the merely personal. When read in light of O'Connor, the theme of rape takes on another layer in which the poem uses the same symbol to portray the American post-war fear of invasion. Finally, the two women present different ways of resolving the trauma. Plath promotes a purely Freudian vocalization, while O'Connor points, as usual, to grace. In this way, O'Connor provides an alternative to Plath's ideological bent when it comes to the resolution of trauma. It's my belief that the conversation between O'Connor and Plath is just beginning, and that they have a lot to say to one another about writing characters with trauma and the broad and multifaceted experiences of women in post-war American life.
All right. And I am last but not least. Can you all hear me properly on this? All right, perfect. So following that really good presentation, I'm going to be reading The Extra People in the World, Xenophobia and Anti-Miscegenation in O'Connor's The Displaced Person. To begin, in 1950, the U.S. Congress renewed the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which established rigorous parameters that greatly restricted the eligibility of individuals seeking to immigrate into the United States under its provisions. First, it narrowly defined displaced persons, extending assistance exclusively to those who had reached Allied occupied territories. Second, eligibility was confined to individuals displaced, or DPs, as often noted, during the war and temporarily residing in DP camps within the 6 months immediately following the cessation of hostilities. And finally, the act imposed additional prerequisites, requiring applicants to obtain medical clearance and secure sponsorship from an American citizen to qualify for entry into the United States. These requirements primarily favored people from Europe, predominantly Eastern Europeans and displaced Jews in the post-war years. In his initial signing of the bill in 1948, then President Truman stated, quote, "The bad points of the bill are numerous. Together they form a pattern of discrimination and intolerance wholly inconsistent with the American sense of justice." The Displaced Persons Act of 1948, particularly after its extension in 1950, significantly influenced post-war immigration policies in the United States. Moreover, it provided a greater influence and reflection on societal attitudes towards displaced individuals, themes that O'Connor examines in her short story, similarly titled The Displaced Person. 4 years after its renewal, O'Connor would publish The Displaced Person following the introduction of the displaced family, the Guzaks from Eastern Europe, settling and working on the white Southern woman's farm, Mrs. McIntyre. Other persons employed by Mrs. McIntyre include 2 Negro workers, Sulk and Astor, and the Shortleys, a white married couple on the brink of poverty. As the Guzaks settled, with Mr. Guzak proving himself an invaluable worker for Mrs. McIntyre, the Shortleys are met with the fear of being fired, and their anxieties taking the shape of blatant racism and xenophobic attitudes towards the Guzaks. Soon after, once Miss Shortley has died and her husband is removed from Miss McIntyre's employment, it is revealed that Mr. Guzak intends to marry his cousin to one of the Black workers. This enrages Mrs. McIntyre and ultimately results in the death of Mr. Guzak. By the story's end, all those employed by Mrs. McIntyre have abandoned her, and she is left on her farm alone, save for the single peacock she's kept alive and a priest who visits. What The Displaced Person raises for the reader is a micro-representation of the complex racial hierarchy dominating the South in the post-war era, and in turn, it embodies the South's attitudes towards various others that emerge. We read that the Black workers, the Guzaks, and Mrs. Shortley are all othered in one way or another. In Mrs. Shortley's hatred of the DP's arrival, we are met with xenophobic rhetoric painting the DPs as violent, animalistic, disease-ridden invaders to the Southern world. Briefly after the departure of Mrs. Shortley, we see Mrs. McIntyre's favoritism for Mr. Guzak intensify, signaling a shift in her attitude towards the DPs, yet her vitriol returns when the interracial pairing of Sulk and the Guzak's cousin is apparent. Where Mrs. Shortley previously embodied Southern animosity for the foreign, Mrs. McIntyre represents the South's dissent against miscegenation. Miscegenation has long been a contested topic for the South, with increased support for eugenics studies and the adoption of white Christian nationalism in the South. The preservation of whiteness and white purity equated to the unpopularity of interracial marriage and its byproduct, that being mixed race persons. To begin, I want to look at xenophobia and the anti-European attitudes that Mrs. Shortley and at times Mrs. McIntyre embody. To start, in the second chapter of The Origin of Others by Toni Morrison, she analyzes the emergence of the other and its formation of the foreign and feared non-white identity in American literature. Key among her analysis is O'Connor's short fiction. In her examination, she writes, Flannery O'Connor exhibits with honesty and profound perception her understanding of the stranger, the outcast, or the other. She writes that in the creation of the other, there is an exaggerated fear of the stranger. As previously noted, this process of othering and the fear by which the other represents is often directed at Black persons, which Morrison's text largely focuses on. However, these same deductions can also be applied to the Guzaks, in which they are met with a similar hatred as directed to the Black people in the text. Here we read the culmination of Southern attitudes against immigration or xenophobia manifested in the rendering of Miss Shortley's and Mrs. McIntyre's initial treatment of the Guzak family, particularly Mr. Guzak. Utilizing Morrison's framework of creating the other, we read the ways in which Miss Shortley fears and dehumanizes the Guzaks. In the time before their arrival on the farm, it is revealed that Miss Shortley and Mrs. McIntyre referred to the Polish family as the Gobblehooks, and upon their arrival, Miss Shortley immediately begins to attribute them to insects or animals. In her assertion that Sledgewick sounded like something you would name a bug, and later on, the Gobblehooks, like rats or with typhoid feeds, could have carried those murderous ways all over the water with them directly to this place. Moreover, Ms. Shortley links the Guzaks to violence and the demonic to further instill fear in them. Quote, every time Mr. Guzak smiled, Europe stretched out in Mrs. Shortley's imagination, mysterious and devil, the devil's experiment station. When Mrs. McIntyre implies that she plans to fire the Black workers and even Mr. Shortley to pay Mr. Guzak more money, Mrs. Shortley fears that her fears for the Guzaks intensifies, so much so that she exclaims that she prefers the Black workers to the Guzaks. And here I'd like to mention that, like the panelists earlier had spoken about having to sort of remove the N-word usage. And I tell you what, this is from O'Connor's text, and I tell you what, I'd rather have those N-words than those Poles. Alongside this proclamation, ironically in defense of the Black workers, she asserts that her suspicion of Mr. Guzak was formed when he kissed Mrs. McIntyre's hand when they first arrived, exclaiming to her husband, when Gobblehook first come here, you recollect how he shook their hands, like he didn't know the difference, like he might have been as Black as them. So we see that Mrs. Shortley's hatred is not simply out of the fear for her husband being replaced, but rather her implication that the Guzaks are just as Black as Sulk and Astor. That is to say, they disrupt the binary of Black and white. In Anthony Schistutzel's Southern Hospitality Myth of 2017, he highlights the hypocrisy of Southern hospitality, discussing the way in which xenophobia is entrenched in Southern identity. As he, like many others, assert, there is a clear line of demarcation in which there are those accepted in Southern society, i.e. white Americans, and those that are not accepted. He writes, using Howard Zim's examination of the South, that, quote, the foreigner and the African-American are both outside of that line, yet it does not mean that they occupy the same position. While the foreigner may or may not be welcome, those deemed absolute strangers or aliens can never be, end quote. As Mr. Guzak works on the farm, apparently working harder and better than any Mrs. McIntyre has previously employed, we read the slow integration of Mr. Guzak and his family's entrance into the white social order of the South. As Mrs. McIntyre desires and Ms. Shortley fears, the Guzaks would adopt the ways of the white Southerner and pave the way for Black replacement, an emerging byproduct of the Displaced Persons Act. In a 1952 article titled "The Negro Worker Leaves the South, Displaced by DPs in the North," published in the Chicago Defender, then Claude Albert Barnett, the founder of the Associated Press, Negro Press, focused on the cause of Black migration from the South to the North. In that piece, Barnett draws attention to the displaced persons, highlighting the newly arrived DPs or white DPs were being hired in place of qualified Black workers. Barnett asserted that these DPs were exploiting the systemic racism in America and had even adopted racist behaviors and language themselves. Interestingly, DPs predominantly coming from Eastern Europe are both victims and benefactors of American racism and racialized groupings. According to Alexandra Lewicki in East-West Inequalities and the Ambiguous Racialization of Eastern Europeans, she states that Eastern Europeans have long occupied a position of both power and subjugation, their whiteness affording privileges denied to those other immigrants, yet they are too beneath Western European and American-born whites. She states, quote, Europe's history illustrates that the East has occupied an ambiguous position within racial thought. First and foremost, Europe's East has played no small part in crafting associations of whiteness and Europeanness with modernity, enlightenment, and civilization progress. In various contexts, its elites have located their countries within a racially imagined European center. The East of Europe has also contributed to and benefited from Europe's imperial aspirations and colonial violence. Yet Europe's West has approached these assertions and aspirations more ambiguously. While Eastern European whiteness tended to recognize as a global marker of superiority, it also signified inferiority within racial hierarchies of Europeanness. So despite the prejudice faced by Eastern Europeans, their whiteness often grants them access to assimilation into white American societal norms, offering them an opportunity to be quote unquote civilized or reshaped according to the dominant Western ideals. In the displaced person, this reshaping of Mr. Guzak is evident in moments where he is both indoctrinated into racial stereotypes about Black individuals, and he's praised by Mrs. McIntyre for his exceptional work ethic over those she's already employed. When Mr. Guzak tells Mrs. McIntyre of Stokes stealing a turkey from the farm, she tells him, or rather educates him, that, quote, all Negroes steal. Soon after a conversation with Mrs. Shortley, Mrs. McIntyre explains, quote, I've at last got somebody, Mr. Guzak, I can depend on. For years, I've been fooling with sorry people, poor white trash, and N-words, end quote. In these two instances, we see hopeful beginnings of Mr. Guzak's transition from the other, the foreign, the stranger, into the white familiar, exemplifying Shizutsu's claim that the foreigner may be welcomed. We see, however, this welcoming is predicated on the idea of assimilation or reformation. Though Polish, the Guzak's whiteness and with the proper education that familiarizes them with the social structures at play, it allows them to integrate. Here, the process of othering for the Guzaks transitions into a process of assimilating them solely for Mrs. McIntyre. We notably see Mrs. Shortley never comes to the same resolve. In the different approaches to the Guzaks for Mrs. McIntyre and Ms. Shortley, we see more evidently the racial hierarchy of the South at play and where each of these characters fall in that order. For Mrs. Shortley, she clearly sees herself on an equal standing to Mrs. McIntyre, despite her husband being employed by her for some reason. We understand Mrs. Shortley's view of her position, both on the farm and in Southern society, through her belief that Mrs. McIntyre affirms her status. After McIntyre states that she has long employed sorry people, white trash, and N-words, Ms. Shortley dissociates herself from the white trash label. The text states that Ms. Shortley could listen to this composure because she knew that if Mrs. McIntyre had considered her trash, they couldn't have talked about trashy people together. Neither of them approved of trash. In this, Ms. Shortley views herself as above nearly everyone on the farm save Mrs. McIntyre. Before this, Mrs. Shortley even envisions herself as a white savior hovering above all. She was having an inner vision. She was seeing the 10 million billion of them, the displaced persons from Eastern Europe, pushing their way into new places all over here, and herself, a giant angel with wings as wide as a house, telling the Negroes that they will all have to find another place. In this, she views herself as having the power to dismiss the Black workers and welcome with open arms the other millions of displaced persons like the Guzaks. They, in turn, are all beneath her on that racial hierarchy of the South. As such, we come to then understand the racial hierarchy to be Blacks who are firmly placed at the bottom, non-white others, poor whites or white trash, white others, and then whites at the highest peak. For Mrs. Shortley, she and her husband and Mrs. McIntyre are firmly whites, given their similar disdain of Blacks, the disgust of the white other, that being the Guzaks, and her privilege to discuss all things trash in opposition to herself. But in the shift of the Guzaks from the stranger to the familiar, Mrs. Shortley's status shift as well. For one, we notice that Mrs. McIntyre no longer confides in her as before, and two, she becomes aware that her husband is going to be fired from Mrs. McIntyre's employment. For Mrs. McIntyre, the Shortleys occupy a position beneath her, as she makes no distinction between the white trash she's previously employed and the Shortleys. By the time the Shortleys leave the farm with Mrs. Shortley's death, Mrs. McIntyre's favoritism of the Guzaks is deepened only to later be corrupted by Mr. Guzak's intent to marry his cousin to sulk. So this is where we get into conversation about anti-miscegenation in the text. David Batchelor's Chromophobia of 2000 examines the West's reluctance to adopt color, particularly in art. When Batchelor argues that the color has been an object of extreme prejudice in Western culture, since antiquity, color has been systemically marginalized, reviled, diminished, and degraded. Interestingly, the same way in which colored pigments are in art disregarded to Batchelor are seen in the ways persons of color are marginalized or othered, as explained by Morrison. Batchelor states that this purging of color is usually accomplished in one of two ways. In the first, color is made out to be the property of some foreign body. In the second, color is regulated to the realm of the superficial, the supplementary, the inessential, or the cosmetic. In one, color is regarded as an alien and therefore dangerous. In the other, it is perceived merely as secondary, a quality of experience, and thus untrustworthy of serious consideration. Color is dangerous, or it is trivial, or it is both. The use of color then becomes an act of being corrupted, a lapse, a fall. Batchelor calls this the fall into color, the fall from purity into the foreign, into the secondary, into the dangerous. I use this to then frame our understanding of anti-miscegenation attitudes, that those that engage in interracial coupling and miscegenation are similarly seen as a fall into the other and out of the whiteness and out of its dominance. Miscegenation in the wake of the postbellum period of the South dominated much political thought. Its discourse emerged in many legal cases, such as obviously Loving v. Virginia in 1967, but also Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, in which oppositionists to desegregation of schools argued Blacks and whites socially interacting would inevitably lead to the sexual interactions and therefore emergence of mixed persons. In the South, the increased production of mixed-race children threatened to destabilize a system of racial segregation rooted in keeping social relations between Blacks and whites separate and distinct. An increased population of mixed-race individuals would make it harder to preserve such racial boundaries. In Nam versus Nam of 1955, a white woman in Virginia sued to have her marriage with a Chinese-American man annulled on the grounds of anti-miscegenation statutes in Virginia. In the court's decision granted in favor of the white woman, it was argued that the purpose behind the preservation of anti-miscegenation laws was to first and foremost preserve white racial purity. Thus, the increase of mixed-race individuals was perceived as a direct challenge to establish racial hierarchy and the destabilization of white dominance. In Virginia Grant's article on miscegenation and its link to communism in the Displaced Persons, she highlights the white fear and reaction against miscegenation in the text. For Grant, and I in agreement with her, miscegenation is the sole reason that Mr. Guzak is transformed in Mrs. McIntyre's eyes from the most valuable employee she's ever had to one whose presence is a burden. As I previously noted, we see Mr. Guzak transform from the other, a foreign Eastern European that embodies fear and disease, to a reliable, good white man, hardworking and dependable for Mrs. McIntyre, opposing the white trash and Black persons she's formerly employed. Once Mr. Guzak's intention to marry his family to Sulk, he once again becomes the other, a danger to the Southern way of life predicated on racial boundaries and white purity. It is Sulk who reveals the marriage pact between he and the Guzak's cousin. Mrs. McIntyre finds Sulk looking at a photograph and questions him on the subject. Quote, "It was a photograph of a girl of about 12 in a white dress. She had her blonde hair with a wreath in it, and she looked forward out of the light eyes that were bland and composed. Who is this child?" Mrs. McIntyre asks. When it is revealed that the girl in the photo is Mr. Guzak's cousin and that she's going to be married to Sulk, Mrs. McIntyre's reaction is both shocked and horrified. As soon as she got in the house, she lay down on her bed and shut her eyes and pressed her hand over her heart as if she were trying to keep it in place. Her mouth opened and she made 2 or 3 dry little sounds. And then after a minute, she sat up and said aloud, "They're all the same. It's always been like this." And she fell back flat again. The description of the young girl is the first trigger for Mrs. McIntyre's reaction, interestingly following up after her presentation. Her white dress and blonde hair both symbolize her purity, white purity rather. She, like the Guzak children who are both pretty and highly fluent in English, represent the possibility of the perfect white assimilation for the family. They enter the country as strangers, yet are afforded the ability to ascend the social hierarchy and become white Southerners. Yet marrying the young girl to Sulk, this is the fall. The fall for the Guzaks into color, specifically into the social stratus of persons of color, and the fall out of their newly ascended status as favored whites of Mrs. McIntyre. We see that she does not associate them with white trash and favors Mr. Guzak above all others. Thus, it horrifies her to find that they have fallen from their both status and fallen from grace, or rather her grace. When she states that they are all the same, it's always been like this, she changes her view of the family and now associates them among the white trash and Black persons, both of which in her eyes are sorry people. She ultimately confronts Mr. Guzak in this decision, stating, "I want to talk to you. You would bring this poor innocent child over here to try to marry her to a half-witted thieving Black stinking N-word. What kind of monster are you?" Again, further highlighting the fear of dirtying or ruining the white purity and innocence of the young girl that the young girl represents. As Grant notes, this fall from favor for the Guzaks ultimately leads to Mr. Guzak's death, as Mrs. McIntyre plays a passive and dismissive role in his accident. She watches as a tractor rolls over Mr. Guzak, deciding not to tell him to run, move, or jump out of the way. The text even insinuates to some degree that she calculates the trajectory of the tractor's path, keenly aware that it would crush the displaced person if he was unable to move from its path. In some subconscious way, Mrs. McIntyre fulfills her desire to see the marriage between Sulk and the young girl unfulfilled, thus thwarting the threat of miscegenation and maintaining the fragile racial order of her farm. The intricacies of racial hierarchy and the phenomenon of othering as explored in this reading reveal the pervasive and destructive forces that shape the social fabric of the post-war South. Toni Morrison's notion of the othering provides a critical lens to understand the dehumanization and marginalization that occur when power structures are designed to exclude and alienate. Just as Morrison articulates the ways in which identities are constructed through the exclusion of the other, the dynamics in the displaced person demonstrate how whiteness is not a static identity, but one that is fiercely protected through boundary-making exclusion. This exploration of racial hierarchy and its intersections with assimilation and anti-miscegenation laws illuminates illuminates historical and cultural implications. The Guzak's narrative serves as a microcosm of larger societal mechanisms that seek to sustain racial segregation and white supremacy under the guise of order and tradition. By unraveling these layers of prejudice and conditional acceptance, the displaced person allows for pervasive and insidious nature of these systems to be critiqued, as well as their capacity to shape the individual perceptions and actions. In doing so, it invites deeper reflection on historical roots of these dynamics and their enduring influence on contemporary discussion of race and belonging. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open for questions and comments. Yes.
Thank you all so much for your capability to break up. I had a question for Rosie. You were making me think about the early study of her story, Stroke of Good Fortune, which is, arguably about kind of reproductive coercion, kind of the implication that the main character has, gotten pregnant by her husband who knew that she's not a kid pregnant, and that he did it purposefully. And it's an interesting story because O'Connor seems to have not liked it very much. She tried to pull it from her first collection of stories. And I think she wrote to a friend that there was kind of a mismatch between the comic tone and the kind of the content of the story. And she never really goes back to reproductive coercion that I know of in her later work. So I was just curious if you think that her kind of comic tone and her kind of comic vision, if that limited her ability to write about certain kinds of trauma, or at least to write about certain kinds of trauma in an explicit rather than sort of implicit way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's hard for me to say that O'Connor is limited in any way, just because I think she does so much. I think it is true that she doesn't deal with that reproductive vulnerability, I think is how you termed it. She doesn't deal with that in a lot of her stories. And that might be because of the comic tone. It might be because of the Southern sensibilities that she is raised with and she grows up with, kind of it's a sensitive topic that's not suitable for polite conversation. But she does mention rape, at least in the Violent Buried way. But yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to think about it more.
Yes.
Well, just to comment on that, like the earlier panel, we heard about Good Country People, right? And they are like in that moment with the threat of it's not funny at all, right?
Yeah.
So
it's very. I think it's one of those. I think Angela called it a present absence or something like that. Like it's kind of unspoken. Even in Good Country People, it's like the condoms are laid out there, and it's not ever really like explicitly said, and yet it's definitely present. Or you think about all of the stories where there's a woman alone on a farm, and that at least for a woman that brings something to mind, and a man comes to her house. A woman alone on a farm and a man comes to her house. So kind of that present absence of a threat that's there for a woman writer would kind of be implicitly implied. It would be implied, but not spoken about and not comically discussed either.
Yes.
I was wondering, especially when you were talking about how trauma could manifest in the body, Sylvia Plath had a very typical relationship with her own body. Her mother had these high expectations for her weight, and so she was a voracious eater. She was very tall, but she had a lot of issues with eating disorders. And then O'Connor obviously suffered from lupus. So I don't know if you could comment on that a little bit in terms of what you see, what you were just talking about with like the unresolved trauma, how that gets manifested in the body, and how both of them are interested in that. And it shows up, as you said, Plath kind of vocalizing it in her poetry, O'Connor sometimes approaching doing that, but not necessarily for her characters finding that kind of resolution. So do you think maybe their own experiences of physical limitations or physical like medical challenges that had something to do with their focus on that? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing that I see in both Plath and O'Connor is they're very embodied writers. They use a lot of bodily language. They dwell on body parts a lot in their writing. And I think that does have something to do with they were both very aware of their body, either because of the suffering, because of the judgment they received, as you mentioned with Plath. And so I think that is certainly one of the similarities between the two of them. And also I think one of the reasons, this could just be my speculating, one of the reasons I think the Holocaust becomes a topic for both of them is because the human body is so objectified in the Holocaust. And I think they deal with the objectification of bodies and struggle with the objectification of their own bodies. O'Connor is kind of a test subject in some ways, like you think about the injection she had to take, and then Plath as well with her suicide, and then the many relationships that she went through. I think they both are struggling with that, maybe not feeling at home in their body, or at least definitely struggling with their body, and it comes out in their writing quite a bit. So.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think we're all of it, but when you were talking about the reproductive vulnerability, I was thinking the mind state, maybe your own, there's another example of that, this is selling off her daughter, in various ways.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Mhm. No, that's very true. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of, I found after reading, I was doing a thesis on O'Connor and then another very long paper on Plath at the same time. And I found so many similarities. And when after reading O'Connor after Plath, you see a lot of that vulnerability in her female characters that's unspoken, I would say.
Yes.
Maybe it's more of a throwing another text in than a question, but there is a major character who's raped in O'Connor, that's Tarwater. And I guess I'm wondering how you connect that moment to some of the things you're saying about relative to time.
Yeah, I think it is, and it's not comic whatsoever.
No.
I think there, and O'Connor, what I was talking about with Grace and Plath has this very Freudian direct answer, and O'Connor has this thing that we struggle with as O'Connor critics, is that I've talked to different people who read O'Connor, and they really struggle with the fact that she sees these violent acts as the means sometimes of someone coming to God, and Tarwater's rape seems to be like it's only after that he has that hunger for the bread of life, and so I think that O'Connor uses it, but she doesn't trivialize that moment. But it is interesting that the rape is of a young boy, and we don't ever see a female rape, even though it is there, definitely underlying. But yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that more.
Yes. I think you're the hand up next. Yeah.
Thank you all for your papers, they're all fascinating. I was thinking, as you were talking, John, about the myth of Southern exceptionalism and the idea that the national other of the South has propped up this myth of American innocence. And I was thinking of Baldwin in Fire Next Time, where he talks about the myth of white innocence, and how white people really need to get rid of that. And that always reminds me of the passage in Everything Rises Must Converge, where Julian, for all of his hateful thoughts about his mother, he occasionally looks over at her and he looks into her blue eyes and he says, she's just innocent. There's this innocence there. So that passage has always bothered me. As you might imagine, it's part of the prickliness of that story. And so I was just curious if you have any thoughts about how I often think that Baldwin and O'Connor intersect in all kinds of ways, even though she didn't like him, but she agrees with him in a lot of ways. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that in connection with this idea of cost and innocence.
Yeah, so I admit I need to read more Baldwin than I have. So that's a whatever area I need to catch up on. I think she only read or only saw some of his televised debates. I don't think she ever read James Baldwin. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe she read some of his articles. But yeah, I think just to my point here, where I'm talking about Dr. King, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, Howard Zinn, is she had, and Baldwin is, writing in O'Connor's own lifetime, enlarged her circle of who were her intellectual others, actually listen to them. It could have deepened her own impulses in what to me are more meaningful directions. Yeah, but Baldwin that's a blank spot that I need to read more Baldwin than I have. Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Yeah, it's all fascinating to pull them together. Maybe this is directed more towards Justin and John, of just how the simpler kind of point is kind of how you would point to or speak to kind of this unexpected capacity, if there's any in Flannery O'Connor for thinking about racial or class solidarity. Because it seems like what I've been hearing is that she's very good at visibilizing hierarchy and social hierarchies, even as they try to like hide themselves and avoid, right? Whether that's the kind of Northern innocence. And indeed, right, thinking about MLK, right after, 64, 65 Civil and Voting Rights Act, like he goes to Chicago. He's like, okay, like I actually need to go north now for the Chicago Freedom Movement. Or even, I mean, you could think what came to mind, John, with your talk was the sociologist, Musal Garvey, is we had never book thinking about kind of capture of social movements within capitalist kind of structures more broadly. And especially with that last short story, how there's a certain, like, it's almost precarity all the way down, right? You think even Miss McIntyre as this kind of precarious widow, kind of how patriarchy shapes the larger, right, kind of social valuation. So is this a kind of a way of inviting into a more constructive or mutual recognition kind of thing, or through this kind of tragic lens? Is there, how would you speak to this?
Sorry, Space, and he was like, he's gonna answer because he's a lot smarter than me. Can you restate the last part of that question for me?
Yeah, so like, how can these texts be used as a means of, I don't know, community building solidarity, if only through exposing? Is it just that like, this is like really hard work of, internal critique, or are there moments of kind of real human recognition, even though there's all of this kind of infighting and I don't know.
So I feel like I'm probably a minority in Flannery O'Connor discourse and discussions, where I think that she does a really good job of doing that sort of internal reflection of both herself and as a society. And as it was mentioned in the first panel around like 10:30 this morning, kind of reconciling with the idea that she understands and acutely is aware of the racist society she's in, but also understanding that she's racist herself. I think in one of her letters, just because you all were talking about Baldwin, she mentions how she's interested in Baldwin. She would love to meet Baldwin in one of her letters, but she would never meet him in the South, right? That the parameters of the South prevents any sort of reconciliation with that or any change. So it's kind of like her work reaches the momentum of, we all recognize that we're racist, or we recognize that we are a fraught society built on these hierarchies, but there's kind of no end game to fix all of this. Because in a lot of her short stories where they are confronted with Black people or others, there is no other way of ending it other than death, right? So like in Everything That Rises Must Converge, Julian's mother dies as a result of a confrontation with a Black woman. Mr. Guzak here dies, and the Negro workers and the Shortleys are all fired, and Mrs. McIntyre is left alone. So just from my understanding, that there's a lot of work of just pointing things out, but not actually resolving them, if that makes any sense.
I think it's on that there's more history than one would think kind of at the outset of interracial class-based solidarity in the South, but a lot of that's kind of hidden history. Yeah. And so you think like the People's Party of the 1890s, to some extent the Republican Party of Reconstruction, labor movements in the 1930s, how much O'Connor was personally aware of that, I don't think much. In 63, she got a copy of C. Ben Woodward's Strange Career of Jim Crow and then Origins of the New South. Woodward is excavating some of that hidden history. So she would have learned kind of late in life about that. I don't really see it in her stories. I do see it saying some of Richard Wright, W.E.B. Du Bois, where they're looking at these kind of fragile or, tenuous glimpses of class-based connection. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, Jessica, if you could talk a little bit more about the essay that you mentioned from Morrison, Organ, and others, and what exactly, I think you said she notes O'Connor's perception, but I wasn't sure of what that was. Can you give like a little more context about that essay?
Yeah, so For Morrison, she's talking broadly about like American literature, and her examination of O'Connor's work is probably just like a paragraph and a half. And it's focusing mostly on her short story, The Artificial N-Word, and the way that othering is made through that short story of Nelson and Mr. Head's venture into Atlanta. So from that, I was just using that framework of the action of making the other, and where she largely speaks on like how the other is made in that specific short story of Black people is applicable to how she's doing it towards other white people in her other short stories. For O'Connor, I mean, that she makes the other out of like Holga from Good Country People and the Goose X here.
Yes.
So Jessica, I really like what you said about O'Connor's sort of self-awareness of her own racism. And it reminded me of part of John, when you were giving your paper about the context of that passage about Dorothy Day coming down. It seems a long way to come and get shot. And you probably know this, but she introduces that the clause, all of my thoughts about it are entirely uncharitable, such as seems a long way to get shot and so on. And it seems like there is a lot of this kind of self-aware kind of framing of her intuitions in a kind of dramatized situation or confessional mode in the letters, especially in a number of places where she makes the worst comments in the letters. I guess I'm curious what you guys make of that, or what the panel as a whole makes of this kind of, this tendency to go to a kind of meta level when she is kind of grappling with her own contradictions. Does that make sense?
I'd say on that, I think, and I'll have to think on that more, but it seems to me that there's kind of more, like the Dorothy Day letter about Dorothy Day is 1957. So I think there's a little bit more self-consciousness and maybe sort of a sense of she's guilty by her own ideals. By 63 or so, I think there's a lot more just knee-jerk Southern defensiveness. And that matches the dominant discourse at the time. So it's like the guilt has kind of gone out. And at least I haven't exhaustively studied her letters, but the ones I was looking at last summer at the Russell Library, it didn't seem like there was much guilt there amidst the just, viciously racist comments she's making. I didn't see much guilt. But I think in her fiction, at least to me in Judgment Day and Revelation, especially Judgment Day, she's really getting profoundly at what would it mean for white folks to give up their racism. So I think she's kind of there in her fiction in a way that she's not living out, is not there to live out and realize. Had she lived longer, would that have yielded insight to her and some kind of epiphany? But yeah,
How do you get that for that then? The way that if she's able to get that kind of self-awareness in the fiction that doesn't show up in the letters. A story like Revelation is best case.
yes. I'm a historian, so I don't really have much in my field with literary analysis, but I guess I kind of think like Faulkner, where you like read these Faulkner novels, like this man was just on another planet, this kind of thing. Then you listen to his prose statements, you're like, he just sounds like a typical like Southern guy, white man of his generation, So that kind of gap between what one can get at in art versus what one can be conscious of and articulate to oneself or others. Any comments on that? Okay.
If I could just weigh in on that, I think it's just on Bill's question. I think it's very interesting, as you were mentioning these books that she's reading in 1963, and in 1964, just 3 months before she dies, she's reading Tom Gossett's.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
She's writing to Gossett and saying, like, your book is so interesting.
Yeah.
She says, my spiritual director, Father McGowan, wants it, but I'm not going to give it to him because he won't give it back to me.
Yeah.
So here she is 3 months before her death in one letter, obviously thinking about race in a very challenging way, and in which she might not have done, years earlier. And then yet at the same time, in 1964, she's writing a nasty letter about Louise, the housekeeper, when she gets home from the hospital and Louise hasn't done any work, you know? So
Right.
I think this is the nature of her ambivalence, like
Yeah.
from person to person and letter to letter, you know, it varies. So it's kind of hard to see a trajectory, it seems to me, because she keeps going back and forth, you know, about it, as is the case with anybody who has strong feelings both ways, you know? So,
Yeah.
yet in the stories, we do see this, in the letters, but in the stories, we really do see this kind of clear trajectory.
Yeah. I think so. Yes.
This is maybe more a comment than anything else, but listening to John and Jessica's papers together, one thing that occurs to me, it seems to me that the displaced person is actually O'Connor's story, where she is rejecting American exceptionalism most clearly, right? I mean, it's some of this has to do maybe with the way that I teach the story, but Mrs. Shortley in her own way thinks she lives in a city on a hill. And if you've read the Puritans, if you're doing this in an American Lit survey, the paranoia, the fear of conspiratorial thinking, the fear of miscegenation, right? You could say maybe that begins in New England, right? And if you think about Hawthorne and O'Connor, and the fact, of course, that who's proposing miscegenation, it's the Catholic immigrant. So the anti-Catholicism, right, of Mrs. Shortley in particular connects to that. It's one of her stories where, yeah, it's easiest for me to put it into that larger national sort of framing. And I guess going back to Angela's comment too, I mean, this is this is in the 1950s that she's writing this, but here she seems pretty clearly to the displaced person himself as a Christ figure, and he's come to propose an interracial marriage. You know, it's pretty crystal clear. He's one of her most obvious Christ figures. You can make the case the story is kind of didactic in a way. It's not as ambiguous as some of her other songs, it seems to me.
Yeah. Thanks for the comment.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry, somebody said this and I just didn't hear it, but you don't mention the concept that really happened, that we needed, they actually got published. And it's something that how it did. I didn't know that, but I was surprised I learned that after the series.
Right.
Sorry.
No, it had not been mentioned. So yeah, thanks. Any other comments while we're together? Okay, thanks for attending this after lunch panel. Appreciate your interest.